Dark Souls 1 is one of my favourite games ever made. We could sit here for ages praising the game, what it did right, the lengths it went to push the player without holding their hand, but that's for another video, for another time. This is a video just like my other What Went Wrong videos where we look at the negative aspects of the game and explore that section, making criticisms where I deem necessary. But as I mentioned, Dark Souls 1 is one of my favourite games, but that doesn't mean it can't be open to criticism. And to be honest, a lot of these criticisms I have against Dark Souls 1 has been alleviated in the future installments. But I know this video is going to most likely receive an abundance of hate, but honestly, I'd rather have that than blindly praise a game where I know segments are flawed. But a lot of these negative aspects come with the age of the game. With it being the second one in the franchise, if you include Demon's Souls, From Software were going to get things wrong. They certainly did more right though, and bear in mind, these things will have most likely been said numerous times over the course of 5 years, however there's still a few things I'd like to talk about. So without further ado, let's have a look at some of the stuff that went wrong in Dark Souls 1. I feel as though I should get the criticisms that have been alleviated in Dark Souls 2 and 3 out of the way first. These are stuff that has been fixed in the later titles, and they mainly come down to minuscule gameplay mechanics and the UI. The biggest problem I have when returning to Dark Souls 1 is the lack of the omnidirectional rolling whilst being locked onto your target. This is where you're locked onto your enemy and you can only dodge in 4 directions: forward, back, left or right. After playing Dark Souls 3 or 2 and then coming back to the first, this is for me the most apparent difference in combat. I've died many times in Dark Souls 1 because I tried to dodge diagonally through an attack, only to dodge to the right or left and get hit. Dark Souls 1 is notorious for feeling quite clunky, where you can feel the weight of your armor, and I love the aspect in that game. How armor values matter and how much it affects your character's ability to move and roll. Yes, this non-omnidirectional roll doesn't take long to get used to, at all, but it was not until the later games where we did have that option did I find myself not liking it and noticing it more in Dark Souls 1. Next is the UI, specifically the inventory menu. The vertical nature of the inventory menu and how you navigate the menus is quite frustrating. With so many items in the game per category, it can take quite a bit of time to locate what item you actually need. Obviously, with the item box, the piece of kit that lets you inventory manage from the bonfire, allowing you to put items from your main inventory into a storage box, this little issue gets somewhat squished. Add this with the fact that you can't pop numerous souls and can't hand in Covenant items in bulk, and well, I don't really need to explain why this is bad. Luckily, as I mentioned, all of these got fixed later on in the franchise, and you can't get everything right from the get-go. These are things that are just always in the back of my mind when I return to Lordran. Oh yeah, I'm going to have to pop 30 humanity individually and then hand them in separately, and then pop individual souls. And I hear the nitpicking, believe me, but obviously these things were prevalent enough to be changed later on, and thankfully they were. In some areas, ease of life changes are warranted, but in some areas, ease of life changes I feel can have a negative impact on the game as a whole. I've always been vocal about my dislike with the warp ability between bonfires in all of the Souls games. A very common opinion is that Dark Souls 1 level design is the best in the series, which I agree with. From Firelink Shrine to multiple areas in the game connecting via elevators and passageways, you truly get a sense of feeling lost in an interconnected world. It's wonderful. Getting lost feels good in this game. The wondrous feeling of realizing where you are after taking a shortcut, finding that area you've been in previously after wandering out of a new area, and knowing your struggles were not in vain as now you have a new way of getting back. This is all well and good, until you get the Lord Vessel, the item that lets you warp between bonfires instantly. When you retrieve this item and the ability to do this action, the areas that open up to you, the Duke's Archives, the area before Nito in the Tomb of Giants, and then the end of the Demon Ruins, all have one thing in common. They all fall into a linear fashion. The connecting zone-like level design that were prevalent in the areas at the start of the game are nowhere to be found. And I feel this is because of the fact we have the ability to warp now. I feel this is the case in all future Souls games as well. I don't think it's coincidence that when we're in part of the game where we do not have the ability to teleport, it's the best piece of level design we have had in the entire series. Probably because they needed a way for the player to get to the areas and they didn't have to rely on simply sitting at a bonfire and teleporting away. They had to ask the question, how do we get the player from point A to B? Not only that, but this gets amplified for the player as well. Let's say you're at Firelink Shrine, which is A, and you want to get to Darkroot Garden, which is B. You have to learn the layout and remember how to navigate your surroundings. You progressively learn that the quickest method is up the elevator, through the church, down to Andre, and then you're at the garden. Have the ability to warp, however. Sit at the bonfire in Firelink and teleport to the Undead Parish, and you're there. You do not need to learn anything besides the name of the bonfire you need to go to. And this is what is so special about those initial zones in Dark Souls 1, and why for me, the later sections in this game feel, well, I don't want to say underwhelming, as that might be a bit too harsh, but more so less good. Also, the fact we didn't have the ability to warp in the earlier stages I think was the root reason we had the ability to level up via the bonfires, and this is one of my favourite things in Dark Souls 1. Not only do we feel a sense of progression as we traverse through the level, but our character also starts progressing, and we're becoming more and more powerful as we go through a zone. In Dark Souls 2 and 3, having to return back to the hub system was frustrating. Not only was it less convenient, but I found it took me out of that mindset. After visiting the hub and going back to where I wanted, I always asked the question, okay, where was I? Whereas in Dark Souls 1, after leveling up at the bonfire, I asked, okay, where's next? Keeping on the topic of areas in the game, it probably comes as no surprise to hear that I'm going to mention Lost Izalith. You might hate Blighttown all you want, but Lost Izalith is probably the weakest zone in the game because of two reasons. One being it actually wasn't a thing until pretty late into the development cycle, so much so they hadn't even conceptualized it yet. Then two, because of that, they didn't have time to finish it. Now I may have got that wrong. There's rumors online about why this area is so weak in design, with copy-paste enemies, dragon butts, and a really awful boss design at the end. This area is the black sheep of areas in Dark Souls 1. It sticks out for all the wrong reasons, and you can't really point the finger at anyone here. They had an idea, but they didn't have time to execute it to its fullest potential. A lot of this area feels like filler. As you traverse the lava, I got a sense, and I still do get a sense to this day, of prolonging the area by having this huge scope, but with very little to do. Just before the Bed of Chaos, you actually get a sense of what this area could have been, with tree branches leading into a hidden area, then that area being connected to Demon Ruins, which is then connected to Blighttown, and then that to multiple other areas. This area had potential. It had vision, but it looked as though time got the better of them. It's not even that this area is necessarily awful per se, but when compared to the quality of the previous zones, with most of them being memorable for their own unique way, whether that be aesthetic or challenge, Lost Izalith, for me, is remembered for being weak. That coupled with the lava continuously burning my retinas out. Now I'll put my hand up right now and say I cannot critique the PvP aspect in this game because it's just something I didn't participate in. I've dabbled here and there in the later years after hearing the horror stories about instant backstabs, and in my brief moment in the PvP scene it's most certainly something to take into account. But again, I'm not knowledgeable enough about this specific area to give my 2 cents. When I was writing for this video I was taking notes and putting various elements of the game in a like and dislike pile. And one section of the game where I just couldn't make my mind up was the method in which you upgrade your weapon via the numerous Titanite paths. There's 8 different types of upgrade methods in this game, and these are used for upgrading different weapons with certain infusions. Boss or unique weapons are separate, and I know this can be very overwhelming and convoluted, especially with how you get boss weapons and such, where you have to have a certain level on your weapon to then transform it into a boss weapon. But part of me kind of likes this. Yes, like I mentioned, it can be quite difficult to understand and become familiar with, but I feel as though it adds this level of depth to the game. But the other part of me thinks that the refined system used in Dark Souls 3 is also great. Both can be good, but which one is better? Well, in my opinion, Although the Dark Souls 1 system does add this level of depth, I personally feel Dark Souls 3's system, where you have only 3 ways of leveling your weapon, is better. But even when writing this, I'm not really sure why, other than that it's easier. When I think of it, the fact you have to go out into the world to certain blacksmiths for your certain infusion types in Dark Souls 1 is, well, fantastic, because it does just that. It gets you out of the world. From an ease of life perspective, having things all in one area, just like in Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 3, is convenient, but I found myself not returning to areas as much as I did in Dark Souls 1. The fact you need to go to the giant blacksmith for lightning, Vamos for fire, and so on and so forth, actually gets you out, and like I mentioned earlier, you learn the best possible way to those blacksmiths. Yes, most of the blacksmiths have a convenient bonfire placed near them, but you're not just doing everything from your hub system. Moving back onto the upgrade path, it's similar to Demon's Souls. There's upgrade materials in the game where I just forgot what they do. The same thing happens with me in Dark Souls 1. If I want a divine weapon, I have to level up to +5 via normal Titanite, and then grab green Titanite so I can switch it to divine. Or say I want a lightning weapon, I have to go to +10, head to the giant blacksmith and use regular Titanite again? This obviously might not be something you mind, or it might be just something you figured out easily, but for me I always have to scratch my brain when I start upgrading. But is that even a bad thing? Having to think about what you're doing in the game is good, right? Well, it looks as though From Software deemed this as an issue, as in later titles they replace the multiple Titanite paths with elemental infusions via a gem system or a stone system. But part of me just doesn't know if this can be deemed as something that's innately wrong, but more so dips into personal preference. I just want to take some time away from the negativity briefly and talk about something I think Dark Souls 1 does better than any game I've ever played, and that's the setting. I never knew what I really liked aesthetically before venturing into Dark Souls 1. It was never something I looked for or took any notice of, really. Dark Souls 1 taught me that I do in fact love the medieval fantasy setting, and the way it's portrayed in this game is sublime. I think that's a testament to how FromSoft create their worlds. Same thing I had in Bloodborne. I didn't think I'd like the setting, and I was gladly proven wrong. The dark, stacked, damp feeling of the Undead Burg, the heavenly Anor Londo, and the poison-filled Blighttown, the varied zones bringing their own uniqueness to the table, coupled with swords, shields, spears and daggers, knights in shining armor, thieves in dark cloth and mages in robes. Not to get too pretentious, but this game really speaks to me. In a world full of darkness, our only hope is to get up and persevere. When you look back on Dark Souls 1 and find what's wrong with it, it falls down to some minute things that got changed later on. Dark Souls 1 and Demon's Souls laid that foundation for future games, and we owe it that much. There's a reason I feel getting your game labelled as a Souls-like is a bad thing, and this is because you are automatically paired with games like Dark Souls 1, and that's really, really hard to come even close to. Many have tried. Very few, if any, have succeeded. This video has been exceptionally hard to write for, because as I said, people will most likely get rather angry with someone criticizing such a beloved game, so I had to answer the question, should I make this? But not only that, I had to really think hard about what areas of the game I deemed as not very good, and it honestly took some time, because as I mentioned, a lot of these issues have vanished in the newer games. Obviously, those games aren't shy of any faults either, but Dark Souls 1 did a lot right. It paved the way for future Souls games, and in turn, was granted a dedicated, passionate audience, which I'm proud to be a part of. We can't agree on everything, but if we were to agree on one thing, it's that Dark Souls is fucking fantastic. I've been Paragon, and I'll see you next time.